Hello everyone, welcome to this demo on how to use Camera Raw and process your files inside Photoshop into JPEG or a TIFF or a PSD of your RAW files. I'm going to walk you through the steps, and the first thing is knowing how to set up your camera so you can shoot RAW. Usually you press the menu and you go to your settings and it will have image quality and you set it up for RAW. And most people answer, what is RAW? So basically the RAW is the raw data, hence the name, of the camera when you take a picture. Usually you will see a JPEG file if you don't have it on RAW, and that's actually a compressed file from the camera that transforms the image into a JPEG file. So it's a compressed format. Now the RAW file is basically the raw data, and photographers that are professional and are really serious about photography, when they shoot, they basically set up their format to be on RAW because they have the capability of editing their picture or deciding how that compression is going to happen. Okay, which opens up a lot of possibilities, like more dynamic range. There's different settings that you can change, like the white balance. You can bring some of the information back from the exposure and deal with the contrast and saturation and sharpness of your image before it gets compressed. So it's really, really useful. So from now on, I hope that all of you start shooting RAW. I'm going to walk you through the steps of how to process your RAW files and also how they look when you download it to your computer. So when you download a RAW file, this is basically an image from Finder. You'll see that they have the extension of CR2 at the end. I put a JPEG here so you can see the difference. This is usually how you see it when you get a camera and you start shooting. Usually they're JPEGs. But the RAW format for a Canon is CR2, for a Nikon is NEF, and that varies by brand. But usually when you set up your format and image quality to RAW, basically depending on the brand, it might be a different extension at the end. For Canon is CR2, so those are the ones that we're going to be working on. I just put some files here, and I want to point out what the metadata is, because when you download your pictures, they're going to be files, right, like these. Once you start editing in Camera Raw, you're going to have a file created with the same naming convention as your original one. That is going to be your metadata. Okay, so what that does is basically all the changes that you apply to your picture will be in this file right here. So your original doesn't really get touched. Okay, it's almost like you're in the darkroom and it's your negative. Okay. So you basically can do multiple prints of the same negative but with different exposures. You can change, you can crop it differently, but you always have the original negative. So when you have a RAW file, it works in the same way. This is your original image. It will never really change. Even if you adjust the settings in Camera Raw, basically those settings are saved in a different file right here that gets applied to that image when you compress it, okay? You don't have to understand completely right now, but I just want to point that out because when I go into Camera Raw, I will talk about this. And one thing that is really important, once you start editing your picture, you do not want to delete this file or move this file to a different folder without bringing this one. If you do that, basically the settings are not going to be open. When you click this one to open it in Camera Raw, the settings are going to be gone, and basically it's going to go back to 0, which it might be fine. Maybe that's what you want to do if you don't care about like the settings that you did. But if you do want to save the settings when you edit your pictures, you want to bring this file with this one and have it in the same folder all the time. Okay. So that's a very important set. So now you ask her, okay, so I download the pictures, I have them in a folder. This is a folder where I have the pictures that I took. How do you open the RAW files? So to process your RAW files, there's different ways. The way that I usually do it, I use Adobe Bridge to see my pictures and select the ones that I'm going to use. So you can basically drag any of these files all the way down to Bridge, and it will open the images on Bridge, which is this window that we have right here. Okay, so when you go here, drag it all the way to your icon at the bottom of your computer where you have the BR symbol, and it will open the contents of that folder. I want to point out that when you are doing that, you're not opening the files. It's like a viewer. It's like this window. That's what Adobe Bridge is. It's just a window that you can look at your folders and your contents in your computer. The reason why it's useful is because you can basically see all the pictures and thumbnails. There's renaming advantages that you can do here. You can basically put ratings like stars and things like that. So it becomes really powerful in comparison to what your normal like preview here is of looking at your pictures through your software. Okay, so again, you can do that, or you can right click on top of it and you can say open with and find bridge, and it will open the picture. So that's where I'm at right now here in the background. Okay, so this is Adobe Bridge, and I have my raw files right here, and you can see that there's no icon or anything weird or anything like that, and I'm going to show you how that's going to change in a little bit. So to open them, it will be similar than opening an image into Photoshop. You can either select one and double click it, or you can select all of them and then double click it, and it will open in Camera Raw automatically, because Adobe Bridge is going to recognize that this is a CR2, it's a raw file, so it won't open inside Photoshop. It will open in Camera Raw, which is a software that comes with Photoshop. Okay, so I'm going to show you what I'm going to do. I'm going to click on that one and then hold shift and then click on the last one, so they're all selected. I'm actually going to unselect the folder of metadata because I don't need that by pressing command and then clicking on it. Now that I have all my pictures selected, I can just double click on any of them and automatically Photoshop is going to open in this Camera Raw software. So here is Camera Raw. Okay, so this is where you're going to basically process your raw files into JPEGs, or you can open them directly into Photoshop. Okay, so I'm going to walk you through the steps and the different panels and areas that you have. The one on the left is the film strip, where you have basically your pictures and thumbnails, and you can click and go through them so you can see them. Okay, so that's basically that film strip right here. Okay, on the top you have basically some tools, and I'm going to go over some of them, not all of them, but you have some tools there. And then on the right side you have basically the panel that you're going to have the adjustments for exposure, contrast. You have also sharpening panels. So all these right here, these icons are different panels that have different options. So Camera Raw can be really powerful if you use this correctly. I'm not going to go super in deep because my goal for this is that you learn how to process raw files. The main thing I want you to do is get your pictures looking the best they can before you take them to Photoshop. Okay, and the reason of why we're using Camera Raw is because it will allow you to get the best from the original file, okay, before you convert it into a JPEG. So I'm going to walk you through some of the steps so you can get a sense of what we can do in Camera Raw. So I'm going to start with this image right here that is basically, in a dark environment. You barely see the background right here. If you open this image in Photoshop and try to fix it, it would be really hard or almost impossible to get any information from that top part that's really dark, okay, because it's a really high contrast image and there's not a lot of information there. But because this is a Camera Raw file, you actually have a lot more information here, so you're able to bring back some of that detail that is really dark. So I'm going to walk you through the workflow that I use usually and I suggest my students to use. The first thing is go right here to the right side of the panel and look at your histogram, and this part right here, and by looking at this you're able to tell that the image is a little bit underexposed, so it's all the way to the left here. So this area right here on the right side are the whites or the highlights of your image. These are the darkest part or the shadows of your image. These are like shadows that are brighter, midtones, highlights, and then whites all the way on the end. Okay, so this is how this panel right here works. So by looking at this, I can tell that there's a lot of dark area because it's peaking over here and there's not that much white. So we want to get this curve right here pushing a little bit more higher on this area right here so you get more detail. So now that I look at that, I'm going to navigate down and the first thing I'm going to have you guys set up is the profile. You can leave it to where it is, Adobe Color, and there are some other options, but I think that one works well. You can look at standard too, and see how that looks, and you can see how the image changes. Okay, now the one that I want you to focus on before, you can play with that later on, but for white balance is really key. One of the cool things about using Camera Raw is that you can shoot with any white balance because it doesn't matter, because you can change it here. So it will be the same as setting your white balance in your camera. You have the control of rechanging it. So you can put auto, and you can see how that changed it to auto. I can set daylight, and you can see that that does something crazy. So you can actually go through these and see which one works best. It seems like auto kind of was similar to the color balance of that light. So I'm just going to leave it in auto. And if you want to make it warmer, then you can go down here and, for example, drag that temperature a little bit more to the yellow, so you can make it a little bit more warm, the image. So I kind of like that warm tint to it. So I don't really mind that this image is warm. I actually like it. It gives a different mood. So this temperature slider will be really helpful. After you do the auto, you can kind of like fine tune it to your liking. The same as with the tint. If you want to add more green or take away green and add magenta, you can play around with that one. If you want to reset any of these sliders, if you double click on them, they will go back to the original setting. Okay, so for example, if I go in exposure right here and I get crazy and I do that, if you double click that arrow, basically it goes back to 0. Okay, and that's really important. Now I did that, the color, I feel like I got it close to where I want. I'm gonna leave it right there. Now I'm going to go to the exposure. This is where it starts getting really interesting, because if you try to do this in Photoshop, it will not work the same. Now here I can actually push my image significantly, and you can see how that darker area, you get to see some of that detail. Now the pool table is really overexposed. Okay, so you can see that it gets too bright, right? But so you're going to play with this, look how much you can push it, then leave it to an area that you think you can, maybe play with. So I'm going to leave it right there, but I'm going to go down to contrast. I actually don't want to add more contrast because this image is pretty contrasty already. So I'm going to lower the highlights, okay? And you can see that the highlights bring back more detail on that pool table. It was too bright before. Now I get to darken it a little bit without affecting this area, because it's just affecting the highlights. So this is a really cool tool in Camera Raw, so you can lower your highlights, okay, and without affecting the shadow. And then you have the shadow one. That way it will bring back some of that information only on the shadow without affecting your highlights. So you basically get to really balance this image and the values of it by moving the sliders of the highlights and the shadow. Now, just as a notice, like, just because you have this doesn't mean that you're going to push it all the way to the edge, okay? You have to be careful, because when you do that, the image starts looking kind of weird, kind of funny, okay? So what I suggest that you do when you're playing with these, push it all the way and then start bringing it back to see where is an area that looks better, okay? So that's kind of like a good strategy. Push it, it looks bad, and then you bring it back until it looks reasonable, somewhere like there. Okay, and then if you notice that after you did those two, you can go back to the exposure and then figure out, you know what, I actually want a little bit like that. Okay, so that's basically how you navigate through this. The white basically brings down the tones of white, so you can see on the lamp and the pool table is changing a little bit, but not the background. The blacks will add more contrast by adding more black on the dark areas. I usually do very little bit of this one in the white. I don't do a lot of it. You have to be careful with these, because if you do a lot of black, you can see it looks pretty bad. So only a little bit to add more contrast. Okay. So I'm going to add something like 3. Texture, will add texture to the image. Again, I'm exaggerating just so you can see it. Most of the time, not most of the time, I never use any of these at 100%, but I do show you guys, at 100% just so you can see what it's doing. And I'm okay with you guys trying that. Just push it all the way just so you can see how it looks, and then bring it back somewhere reasonable. Okay, so texture kind of like, it's like contrast, but on the edges of things, makes it look more like grungy. Clarity is almost like sharpening. It's also adding a little bit of contrast and taking away some of that haze that you see, and that also goes in conjunction with dehaze. And here it's not going to make that much difference. For example, if you're shooting like an underwater picture, the dehaze will work really well, because basically takes a little bit of that UV kind of light. And also if you're taking a landscape, at the beach, you have that haze, so this will basically work really well to kind of clear all that like softness that you see. So these 3 right here, texture, clarity, and dehaze, basically are kind of like contrast tools that will affect your image differently. The one that I use the most is clarity from these 3. But I don't do a lot of it, right? Because if you do a lot, you see it looks really weird. I usually do somewhere between like 5, somewhere around there, just a little bit to add some, contrast and texture to it. And then texture can be helpful sometimes, and dehaze too. Now vibrance is basically getting all the tones that are not super saturated to bring them a little bit more up. Okay, it's a little bit different than saturation, which basically brings all the colors saturated equally, right? So it's like really intense saturation. Vibrance kind of enhance the soft tones to become more saturated. So it's a little bit different. So play around with these so you can see what they do. Be really careful with the vibrance and saturation. Most of the time, I actually desaturate my image a little bit. I kind of like it more, kind of moody like this, where it's like the colors are a little bit softer. Sometimes like saturated images tend to be like a little bit weird for my taste, but that's a very subjective decision. I just like them to be a little more pastel, kind of like soft looking. So that's basically a quick rundown through these. The best way of learning these is by actually processing them. So I will give you some files so you guys can practice. If you want to see the before and after, you have to go to this bottom part right here where you see this slider icon. If you click there, it will show you that's the before. Look at the difference from that. You can barely see the bottom part or the top part of the image. And then when you click it, you can see that it brings back some detail. So that way you can see where it's at, okay? So it becomes really, really useful to edit your pictures in Camera Raw. You'll be able to open up a whole new world of possibilities with your pictures by editing in Camera Raw. Now, the next one is this. Basically, this one is very similar to what we were doing with the highlights, darks, and shadow. Here is just basically broken apart a little bit nicer. And then this one is the other one that I want to show you, because it's really good to get in the habit of sharpening your pictures before you transform them into JPEG. Now, you don't want to over sharpen, okay? The amount is very key. I usually recommend don't go higher than 100. So I'm usually somewhere between like 50 and 90, somewhere in there, depending on the picture. So you have to look at it and then see how much you want. Once you notice how much you want, there is one slider. You can leave the radius and the detail where it is. The radius affects like the bigger the megapixels in your camera, like the more radius you might need. Most of the time I find that 1 is plenty and I just leave it there. The detail too, if you want to keep more detail or not have it influence the entire picture, I find that 25 is fine, the basic. The one that I definitely move is masking. Okay, masking, basically what it does is it tells the software where that sharpening is going to be applied, because you don't want to apply that sharpening to your overall image. Okay, so what you do is you're going to hold Option down, you press on masking, and then you slide it to the right. Okay, what you see white is basically what's going to be sharpened. What you see black is what's not going to be sharpened. So what you want to sharpen is the edges of things. So you make sure that you can see the edges of the pool table and maybe like the background where all the graffiti is at to show white, but you don't want like the pool table cloth, sharpened, because that's supposed to be soft, right? Or the floor or the top where there's no detail, because that will make it look more noisy. So basically you find what you want sharp and then you can let go. And that's just an aid. Like you can still slide this and it will still do the same thing, but you just don't know what's really doing. So that's why you have to hold Option and then slide it so you can really see where the masking is happening. Okay, but that's really important. Noise reduction, if your image has a lot of noise, this one actually has a lot of noise because it was a very low light and I had to raise my ISO. So you might need to like see if you can soften a little bit the image. I'm going to zoom in so you can see what it's doing. This area right here, I don't know if you can see that there is a little bit of noise there. If I take it off, now you can see how noisy it is in this area. So basically be careful with this because it also softens your image a little bit. So you don't want to overdo it. You want to just add little by little while you're looking at your picture and deciding. You see there, it kind of got a little bit softer. I wouldn't go higher than that. And you can basically play a little bit with like luminance detail on these. Most of the time I just do this one and just do a little bit. I'm really careful with this one. I'm always paranoid that I'm going to make it too soft. So I just do a little bit and then leave it there and that's good to go. There are other options here on the top. I'm not going to go over everything because it's going to overwhelm you. I will go over it later on. when we become more advanced. But right now, the ones that I really want you to focus is the first one, right? So you know how to do all of these. You should definitely do them. And then a little bit of sharpening. And then one that can help sometimes is this one right here that looks like a lens. There is one that says enable profile corrections. And what that does, it identifies what camera you had and what lens, and it puts that profile to fix any aberrations or issues that that lens gives you with that camera, okay, which can be really helpful. So I'm going to zoom out so you can see the before and after. That was before. You can see how it stretches the corner and makes them lighter. And you can see that it identifies what lens I was using and what camera, Canon and everything. So it's pretty cool. Sometimes I don't like what it does. You know, in this case, actually it helps because it brightened up a little bit the top. I can now make the image a little bit darker. And you can also see if the remove chromatic aberration helps. Sometimes it helps, sometimes, you know, I don't like what it does, but you can see that it improved the image, especially on the top a lot, okay? So that's how it was before, and this is how it's now. So that one can be useful sometimes, but if you're not comfortable, don't play with it yet. We can also adjust those settings in Photoshop later by warping your image or making a mask and make it brighter on the top if you need to, okay? So that's basically the main settings. Now I'm going to show you some other settings that might be helpful. I have some images here. I'll give you some files later so you can practice. But let me show you this one. This one is a good example for bringing down the highlights and making the shadow parts a little bit brighter. So I'm going to go and edit this one very quickly. Don't judge my editing skill. I'm going to see how out it looks. Seems like it's okay, but I like it a little bit warmer, so I'm going to make it a little bit more yellow. There we go. Now the colors are starting to look a little bit better. The tint, let's see what it does if I put a little magenta. It kind of looks nice. And then exposure, you can see that the sky is bright. I don't want to ruin that sky out because if I raise the exposure, then the foreground looks great, but then the clouds and the sky kind of gets washed out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep it a little bit only. Okay, I'm going to add a little bit of contrast. I'm going to bring the highlights down so I can bring that sky again. You see, that's why this is so helpful. If you're going to do this in Photoshop in a JPEG, it will be impossible or really hard to do, especially if you have the sky blown out. So now I bring back some of that detail. Now I can make my shadow, which is the foreground, kind of pop. Now it looks like a lot brighter, right? It makes it a lot nicer. So now I keep the sky how it was before, but I brighten up this area right here. I can bring the whites a little bit darker, the blacks a little bit, so I can create more contrast. I can do a little bit of clarity, maybe some dehaze, a little bit. Okay, that's looking a little bit better. Let's see if I can make the highlights even darker. Okay, and then let's see what vibrance does on this one. Yeah, I would probably do that in Photoshop because I like the clouds to be a little bit warmer, a little bit more saturated, but I don't want the foreground to be too saturated. So I'm going to keep it only at a little bit. So I'm going to show you the before and after. That was kind of a quick edit. It's not perfect, but at least it will give us a preview. So that's how it was before, right? Look at that. It looks kind of blue, you know, cyan, and like this, the foreground is kind of washed out, and then boom, look at this. A lot better, right? So that's what I want you guys to do from now on. When you bring your pictures to Photoshop, you always are going to process them through RAW so you can get the best information possible, because if you start with a great image at the beginning, when you start editing in Photoshop, it will make your life better. You don't want to be trying to fix everything in Photoshop. It's great when you start with a good picture from the beginning. So that's what we're looking for here, to start with a good image in Photoshop. Now, let me show you a couple tricks, like, you know, for white balance. I'm not going to cover all the tools on the top, but there are a couple that I want to cover. The first one is this one right here, which is the white balance tool. Okay, it's like an eyedropper. There's two of them. Pick the first one. And what that does is when you're taking a picture, right, if you have a gray card like this one that I have here, that is white ball brand, you basically can click on this and it will calibrate the colors for you. This card right here is a card that is supposed to be calibrated, so it's neutral, so it has no shift in color. So when you photograph, if you put that card in a location where the light source is hitting it, you can calibrate the colors according to that card. So basically you're telling the computer, you know what, this should be completely neutral. And what I mean by neutral is that there is no shift in color, okay? Meaning that there's no more red, no more blue, anything like that. So the computer reads that, and if the light source that's coming, and this one is in a studio, right? So the light, the flash is hitting this card. If it has a shift in color, it was like, you know what, calibrate this so it's neutral, and then it fixes the image for you. It's awesome, it's great. It saves you a lot of guessing when you're editing the colors. You don't want to be guessing because your monitor might not be calibrated. But if you do it correctly and you do it with a gray card, then you take all the guessing away and you basically edit your picture with the colors perfectly. Okay. There are different types. I put another one here. This is an X-Rite color checker. This one is more expensive. These ones you can find it like around 20 bucks. So they're pretty good. I always have one with me or in my wallet, or because if you're shooting, what you do is, if you're shooting outside in the sun, just take a picture with your camera to that card, okay, in the sun, and then in post-production you can sync all your pictures with that card. I'm going to show you how to do that right now. So for example, this is in the studio, and I put the card here so the lights can hit the card. So remember, the light source has to be hitting the card. And then after you do that, you click this one, okay? And now basically it calibrated the colors, even though you can't tell because everything is black or gray. But it did, right? It calibrated the colors. Now, if you look on the left here, I have one picture that I took right after that one. And this one, I want to make sure that the colors are calibrated. So what I'm going to do is, if I went here and I calibrated my image, you can sync these two images. So basically you can tell the computer, calibrate this next picture with the settings that I have this one. So to do that, there's two ways of doing it. You can go here and select all the images, and then they will all be calibrated. When you go here and then click, I go again, and then click sync settings, okay? And the important part here will be the white balance, but you can actually sync all the settings. So for example, if you're shooting outdoors and you got the camera and you fix one picture, right, where like, let's say you took 20 pictures on a field, right, and the 20 pictures have the same light source because it's the sun. You came here to Camera Raw, you edited the first one and it's perfect how you like it. You can actually use those same settings to adjust the other 19 pictures because they're shot in the same environment, okay? And you don't have to go one by one editing them. You can just sync them all to basically have the same settings. So I do that all the time, and it saves you so much time, so that way you can be outdoors and hang out with your friends and family, okay? So once you get here, just make sure that you check the boxes of the ones that you want to sync, and then you press OK. You can do it that way, or in this case, I don't want to sync all of them because these are not shot in the same scenario. I only want to sync these two. So you always have to select first the one that is going to influence the other one. And then I press Command, and then click on this one. So they're both selected. Now I go here to the menu, and I click Sync Settings, okay? Once I do that, this will come up. I actually want to sync everything, and I'm going to press OK. And now what it did is this one right here got the same settings that the other one. I'm able to tell because if you go to white balance, it says custom. Every time you use the white balance tool, it will say custom, or if you modify these right here, okay? So that's really helpful, and you can do the same thing for all of them, okay? Or you can select multiple pictures. Let's say that these two pictures are selected, and if you edit one of them, it's going to edit the other one too, okay? So that can be also helpful. So I wanted to show you that. Now let's assume that you're ready to go, right? You're done editing your pictures that you have here, and you want to basically either save them or open them in Photoshop. Once you're done, you have three options, okay? So you have to remember this. You have three options. You can click Done, and I'm going to go ahead and do that so you can see what happens. I'm going to click Done. Oh, I opened one in there, so let me go to Bridge. There we go. So once I click Done, I don't know if you remember that at the beginning I mentioned that they didn't have any weird symbol, but now you can see that these have a little symbol right there. Okay, what that tells you is that these pictures have been edited. Okay, so if I go to the file that is, of my computer, you can see that now they have the XMP, and that's what I was talking about at the beginning. So these files are the edits that I did of those pictures. Now let's see, I'm going to do one of them. Okay, so the first one, you see the first one that has all the check box, the little boxes. That one is number 6931. So that's the first one right here. And there's the XMP. If I delete this and I move it to the trash, you see that the icon went away? And if I open that picture, it's going to have all the settings on 0 again. So the cool thing about Camera Raw is that you never really change your image. It's just being like saving those XMP files that are going to do the changes once you process your image into Photoshop or into a JPEG. But still, even if you do that, you can always go back and rechange the setting. So that's a really cool thing about Camera Raw. So now that was one option, right? If you hit done, you can, go back, the next day and reopen the pictures, and the settings are still going to be there, and you can still adjust the settings. So for example, this one that I had edited, I can still adjust those settings, okay, according to what I want. All right, so that's really cool. But now let's assume that you don't want to do that. You want to open them in Photoshop, so you have to make sure that you select them all. So you go here, select all. If you only have one selected and you click open image, it will only open that image. So make sure that you select all the ones that you want to open. You go down here where it says open images and you click that, it will open the images in Photoshop. I'm not going to do that yet because I'm going to show you the other way of doing it. Okay, so that's opening images in Photoshop. And it works great if you want to go to Photoshop and keep editing your pictures with mask, or you want to combine images. It works great. But if you just want to save them as a JPEG to turn them in or to post them in social media or something like that, what you want to do is you select them, then you go here on the left where it says save images. So this is basically what your camera does for you when you save them to a JPEG. Okay, but here you did a bunch of edits before you convert it into a JPEG. So it's like so much better. So what you're going to do is select the folder where you want to save it first. Okay, I'm going to save it in the same location, my desktop raw demo. Okay, you can rename them if you want here, but the important part is the file extension. You can actually decide if you want it as a JPEG, okay, if you want it as a TIFF, PSD. We're going to save it as a JPEG. And then I'm going to put quality and maximum. That's perfect. Okay. You don't want to limit the size. Basically, it's just going to save it as a big JPEG, and that's what we want. Color space, you can leave it like that. Image sizing, you can actually resize this if you want a specific like pixel dimension or something like that. But we don't want that. We just want a high quality JPEG that we can save. And then when you hit save, it's basically going to process them. You're going to see 6 right here, and it's going to go to 5, 3. Oh, there we go. It's going quicker. So right now it's processing these files. That metadata file that we did with the settings are being applied to the picture and saving it as a JPEG. So now if we go to our folder right here, this is the file that I had, you can see that now I have my JPEGs right here. So that's the JPEG. You see that the JPEG. Oh, this one is a JPEG, okay, of all my images that were processed. So for example, look at the difference. That was the original one. You can see how that looks, and then look at this one. A lot better. So that's my final edit version of that picture. Okay, now let's go back to here so I can show you what else you can do. So the third option, you have the first one. If you're not sure and you wanted to step away from your work and go back to it later, just click done. If you want to process the images, then you select them and you go to save images and save the location where you want to save them as a JPEG. And then the last one is if you want to open them in Photoshop. You go ahead and click open images. And boom, here you go. It's going to start opening them in different tabs right here on the top. Okay, so now I have all the pictures that I had over there, but on tabs are individually. That's why I don't recommend this one if you only like are processing a bunch of pictures, because you're going to end up with a bunch of tabs here. Okay, so just be careful what you want to do with these. And if you do this, it did not save the pictures. You then have to go from here, file, save as, and save it. Okay, so you're not really done yet. If you're going to save your picture, you have to actually go here one by one and save it. Okay, so that's really important that you know that difference. So I'm going to go again to Camera Raw because I want to show you one last thing. Oh, but I don't have a good picture for that. Let's try this one. One thing you can do, I'm going to open it with, let's see if I can, well, that would not work. So let me go back to Bridge. I'm going to open these again. because I want to show you one tool here that I find that is super helpful, and it's the straightening tool to straighten your horizon. So let's assume that this picture right here, I need to make sure that these cans are aligned. All right, you can go here and click on this one that looks, I don't know, like a ruler, like a little bubble on the level. And what you do is you click across the line. So I'm going to show you. You basically click and hold it down, hold your mouse, and you have to drag it out. You can't let go. You can't let go. And once you get to the end, you have to go across that line, right? You don't do that. You basically drag it across the line. Once you get to the end, then you let go. What that will do is will identify like, oh, that is the line that you want straight. You know what? It's crooked. So it's going to actually straighten it up for you. The only thing you have to do is double click and basically it will be straight. You can use it also for verticals, like if you're shooting a building, you can actually go click and drag it across the edge, and that will also work. Okay, so you can do it in either way, horizontal or vertical. I think that's a really cool thing to do before you take your images to Photoshop. It will be a lot easier than doing it in Photoshop. However, they do have this tool in Photoshop, and I can show you later how to do that. But I think it's better if you do it beforehand. That way you don't have to worry about it. That way you know that your final picture that you got into Photoshop is ready to be worked on, and all the little basic stuff already done. Okay? So that is the little quick intro about Camera Raw. As I said in the beginning, there are a lot of other tools like, you know, cloning and taking stuff out. You have red eye reduction, but I'm not going to cover all that because I feel like some of those things are going to be better to do in Photoshop. The overall thing I want to do here is just get the picture to the good exposure, good contrast and color, so that way you can really edit it in Photoshop if you need to even further. And I think that's all for now. If you have questions, please let me know. I will try to emphasize a little bit more of some of the tools later on, but I think for now at least you have the basics of what Camera Raw can do and the great advantage that it gives us. So I hope that all of you will start shooting RAW if you can, so that way you can really take advantage of this. All right, thank you very much for listening and being patient. I know it was a little bit long, but I'm hoping that you will take advantage of this. All right, see you next time. Thank you very much.